Once upon a time, there were 3 mice. The first mouse lived in a house that contained, along with furniture and other household goods and possessions, a lever and a hole in the wall from which food was delivered. Each time the mouse pressed the lever, he would receive a tasty morsel of his favorite food. The mouse understood that when he was hungry, all he had to do was press the lever and food would arrive via the hole. The mouse took great comfort in the predictability of his access to food and only pressed the lever when he was hungry. The second mouse lived in a similar house, also containing a lever and a hole in the wall from which food was delivered. Unfortunately, the lever in his house was faulty and delivered food on an inconsistent basis when he pressed it, such that he might only receive food via the hole on the 1st, the 5th, the 7th, or even the 11th time he pressed the lever. This mouse learned that he could not always rely on the lever, and that he had to press the lever many times, and even when he was not actually hungry, in order to ensure that he would have enough to eat. Even after his lever was fixed, he found it difficult to stop pressing it frequently and displayed a habit of storing up food. The third mouse also lived in a similar house, containing a lever and a hole in the wall from which food would be delivered. However, the lever in his house did not work at all. He soon learned that he could not rely on the lever and would have to develop other ways of gaining access to food. This belief persisted even when he moved to a new home with a fully functioning lever. This tale of 3 mice, written by clinical psychologist Colby Pierce, is part of his book on Introduction of Attachment Theory. And this theory of emotional relationships and the capacity to create bonds early on in life with our caregivers. According to this theory, the more safe, secure, and dependable those relationships were, the less anxiety a child feels to explore the world, because it knows that it can come back to safety and recharge. Like the first mouse who got the food when it pressed the lever every single time. The source was dependable. And the theory suggests that this secure attachment attributes to other healthy relationships and habits in the future. It's not a given, but likely. However, if the source of safety is erratic at best, like the second mouse, or completely unreliable, like the third mouse, the child's capacity to manage any anxiety in its environment is minimal or non-existent, as these situations put the child into survival mode, and they manage their anxiety in other ways than by going to their safety net, because the safety net isn't actually safe or reliable. The theory suggests that these more anxious and absent attachments attributes to a myriad of relational issues in the future, including stage 4 clinger behavior or even distrust altogether. This theory helps therapists and counselors understand a person's past to help them find healing in the present, and enables them to help their clients toward working to improve their current and future relationships so they can experience more health and wholeness. That's attachment theory. There's a lot more to say about that, but at the basics, that's kind of what we're talking about. So we read this passage from Philippians, one of my absolute favorites. And he wrote in Paul, the author, wrote in his letter, "Don't be anxious about anything." And as I read that this week, I was very grateful for the addition of Psalm 23. Because it's been a week. And I feel like most people in this room could agree with that. I feel like I have said similar sentiments to that a lot over the past few years, as well as another prayer uttered by the psalmist from Psalm 13, "How long, O Lord?" But this week in particular, I have struggled to not be anxious. If you want proof, you can talk to Zach about any day this week. He'll tell you. She struggled. Perfect. Thank you. I love you. Maybe you feel that way too. As Israel and Palestine have gone to war again, costing just an unreal amount of suffering, death, and destruction. The news outlets continue to show us the devastation. In the past, this wasn't as possible. We didn't have to bear witness to it, but now it's everywhere. And people around the world and in our communities are taking sides. You might say standing with Israel, standing with Palestine, or Hamas, because those are two different things. Justifying why their stance is the right one. And even why bloodshed on one side might be okay because it is horrifying for the other, as if one life is worth more than the other. The history and current situation in that part of the world is messy. It's complicated. Certainly not resolved by any simple answers or solutions, especially any that I, a Westerner, could offer. But if you're like me, I've been longing for a simple solution, a place to settle my spirit. I want the conflict to be resolved once and for all because the rising death tolls, violence, and likelihood of this ending anytime soon is very thin. Leaving me holding this tension, this part of my heart that breaks witnessing such immense human suffering. Knowing that the violence and hatred also doesn't end at those borders, do they? Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia here in the U.S., which is already alive and very well, has been further fueled, and folks are angry and they're terrified. War and violence has this tendency to spread rather than being contained. And while the concentration of suffering may exist over there, it certainly has spilled over elsewhere, causing the global community to feel more vulnerable, less safe, less secure, and more apt. If I'm honest with you, which I want to be, I admit that in these anxiety spirals, I haven't been at my relational best. And that certainly impacts the circles of community that I find myself in. So yeah, I feel like there are a lot of things to be anxious about right now. And I, like many, have been trying to manage that anxiety in all kinds of ways, healthy and otherwise. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you. I'm not alone. So Paul, the author of this very personal letter, the book of Philippians, is a letter from Paul to the church at Philippi. The Bible is full of all kinds of writings. They're not all just some kind of historical narrative. Some are letters, some are historical, some are words of prophecy calling folks back. But this particular one is a letter to, I think, maybe Paul's favorite. He's not supposed to say who's his favorites, but I think this might be Paul's favorite church. And it's full of affection and love and care and concern. It was a faith community that he helped to co-create and nurture. But he wasn't writing these words as a blank document to the general church without any specific context or circumstances, but rather to people he loved, who he knew were experiencing anxiety because of the stuff that was going around them, as well as persecution. The anxiety had risen to a level of creating conflict between two of the leaders, Euodia and Syntyche. Way to just barrel through that, by the way. Yeah, beautiful. So these two women who were leaders of the church, I want to say that first, two female leaders in the church at Philippi, in case you need to have some proof that women led. They were having this conflict that was seeping into the community. Oh, and also Paul was in prison when he wrote this. So he wasn't speaking from a place of comfort and leisure, but from a place of captivity. So when we hear his words to not be anxious, I feel a little bit better. Because those words don't come from a place or even to a people that wasn't already naturally filled with anxiety. There was more than enough going on worth being anxious and worried about. And yet, he writes, don't be anxious about anything. Rather, bring up all your requests to God in your prayers and petitions, along with giving thanks. Then the peace of God that exceeds all understanding will keep your hearts and minds safe in Christ Jesus. Peace. It's that second part that's really important. I was very focused on don't be anxious and how dare you. Look around. But we have little to no control over what is happening around us. And even less when considering conflict half a world away. What we do have is God's nearness. God's promises to give us rest. Our holy scriptures, like Psalm 23, remind us that though we walk through the valley, the darkest valley, or another translation, through the valley of the shadow of death, we fear no evil, for God is with us. God's rod and staff, God's very presence, they comfort us. And I love the Psalms because they always seem to have a little bit more courage than I do, except I know that this is their prayer, not necessarily where they are. To a God who draws near to us, who comforts, who strengthens, who grants us a place of safety and security that is dependable to return to as we continue to explore the world. When it's full of joy and when it's full of sorrow. The promise isn't to fix it. I wish it were. But the promise is a place to lay anxieties down and receive some peace. Friends, there's a lot to worry about. There's a lot of work to do. So finding peace isn't and like opting out or something of like doing the hard work. There's a lot out of our control, and the things we are anxious about, the things happening around us that are anxiety producing, may not find resolution anytime soon. Mouse, who knows that when it pushes that lever, it will receive its nourishment, so too will we be met with a peace-giving, comfort-offering, respite-providing God every single time we draw our attention to God's nearness, so that we can continue to navigate an imperfect and often painful world. We aren't alone to face any of it. So in these final moments, I'd like to invite us into a time of prayer, of some stillness and some silence, to do just that, to draw near to that source together, because to be honest, it's been really hard to even do that alone this week. So to get us started, I'm going to read Psalm 23 one more time, to give us some time to share with God the worries and anxieties that we might be facing, individually, corporately, communally. And then I will invite those who wish to share some of the things with each other. And then we'll pray together responding with each cry for God's presence by saying, Lord, hear our prayer. So take a moment and get comfortable in your seat. If closing your eyes would help you to get centered, I encourage you to do that. If keeping them wide open helps, do that too.